Hi there, and welcome to Talking Absolute Worship. We're all from Eastern Synod this morning as we're going to share our thoughts on Ascension. Now, you may be deciding that you're going to do the Easter, I think we're at 7, but we've gone for Ascension, not doing it on the Thursday, doing it on the Sunday, although, of course, you could use what we're talking about on the Thursday as well if you're doing that. So, Peter, what have you got to share with us today?
Well, I thought I'd go with the readings from Psalms and Acts today. So that may be great news for you and Alex, who may have selected the other readings and therefore saying, that's great, we've got masses to say elsewhere. Otherwise, you can correct what I say on the readings that I'm doing, I guess. So, well, both of those readings, I think, have incredibly dramatic openings. And that's one of the things I think I'd want to pick up on. The psalm begins with, clap your hands, all you people, shout to God with loud songs of praise. And then we move on to the trumpets coming in and the sing, sing, sing. It's not exactly an image of quietly waiting on God, is it? It's the complete opposite, where everyone is out in this celebration. And I think we can relate well to, even today, to signs of celebration. I mean, what do we do in a time of victory or a time of celebration? I don't know about you, but I'm quite an outgoing person. And I would be one of those who was giving it a good scream and a shout and a wave and a party and a glass in my hand and everything else. So, and a boogie as well, if I have the chance. And I think most of us would at least bob up and down, clap our hands and sing and chant. It's just natural behavior. And it's odd, isn't it, how when we're sat in church and we want people to behave like that, it's almost like we can't do it here. And yet here's this psalm that's got everybody celebrating and enjoying. It's natural behavior. And in this setting, we're looking at an annual festival marking the enthronement of God, as amid the shouts and the acclamation of God's people, it's about God's rule over the world being acknowledged. And that idea of is then played out as the psalm continues. And by the end of the psalm, we have God exalted and enthroned forever. And I find that's the really interesting bit for me, enthroned forever as God of the world and Lord of the world. And this exclusive joy in God has made this psalm a powerful and a comforting testimony of biblical faith to the God who is always the one who is still to come. So it isn't a static, there's always a looking ahead and an opportunity that this is the one who is still to come. And I think that theme stretches into the New Testament, whereas, for example, we could have the Lord's Prayer continues to hope and pray for the coming of that rule. We actually use that all the time. Your kingdom come. It doesn't say your kingdom is here. Your kingdom come, your will be done. And I think that's picking up on this whole idea of the expectation that still God is coming. And so when we move that into the Acts reading, again, what a blockbuster of a start to the writings. It's as if Luke, having been author to the gospel, wants to get our attention straight away. So rather than doing some long recap, we're just smashed with 11 verses that remind us of the story of the life of Jesus, his death, the giving of the Holy Spirit, and the Ascension in 11 verses. It's my sort of person. Let's get it cut down short and let's get it out there. And so we've got all that in those first 11 verses. And it's here with the Ascension that, of course, we're focusing our thinking. And we find the links that go back into that psalm. The reading starts with, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. So the emphasis here is on his successors who will continue, not out of duty, but from a truth that is disclosed that the work will continue. The whole purpose of Acts is to tell a story that calls its living readers to continue what Christ began in their own time, in their situations, and to the end of history. And I think that's where I want to tie together our psalm with the Ascension and what both mean for our faith and our witness, because I think Acts at times could be seen as task-orientated discipleship. And I think we need to ensure that there's a more contemplative pattern of discipleship as well, that's used to help cultivate relationships with the living Jesus as well as our works. We have such a works-orientated Reformed understanding that sometimes we get nervous when we talk about being more contemplative. And I think we need both, and that both need to come together to help us develop that relationship with the living Jesus. So as well as our works, we need to be contemplative. So in our psalm, there's an understanding of the God and heaven being one and an inseparable bond between God and the people. And even though they've never seen God, they can praise and adore a living reality to them. And then by verse 10 of our reading from Acts, we're told the disciples were looking intently to the sky as Jesus was going. And I guess the question for them, the question for them and the question for us is, can we follow Jesus without seeing or hearing and without his physical presence in our midst? And here is the moment where faith is needed. As we're told, this same Jesus will come back in the same way that you have seen him go into heaven. And I guess a question we might want to put before our congregations today is to reflect on that. What do we really believe when we confess together the good news that Jesus ascended into heaven? Does it actually feel like good news? Would we not rather have the physical presence of Jesus with us rather than watching Jesus go? And I think there's some questions we can tease out and pull out for people there. However, I want to pull the whole thing together by coming back to, by making the ascension an affirmation of good news, that we're stating for ourselves that Jesus is still alive and that the present offers, and in the present offers the Holy Spirit that allows us to minister. God's grace for forgiveness and healing is still present until he returns for the restoration of all things. We're not separated, and the more reflective parts of our faith, prayer, quiet times, and possibly our services as well, help us have a real and meaningful relationship with God that allows the outworkings of our faith to be a natural and responsive coming from the love that we know for ourselves and know that we are not separated, and that one day, as Jesus ascended, so Jesus will return, and that all things will be made new. So that's where I want to finish up. I think there's loads of stuff to play with in the middle of that.
I think there could be a really interesting rhythm to the service based on especially what you were saying about the psalm, that you're saying we're not very good at being loud and celebratory. And maybe this is a good practice for what's coming next week at Pentecost, when we go and we'll be having a really big celebration, because that's what we should be doing at Pentecost. But also in some churches we're not very good at being really quiet either.
No.
Where I was before, which was in it was all age, really small congregation, but babies and toddlers up to old people, some of whom knew how to behave in church and some didn't. After the first ministers gathering that we had, there was good use of little prayer bells. And I used to do that. We'd have quiet every week for sometimes up to 2 minutes. If I could see the toddlers getting restless, it would end slightly earlier, but they could do it because they knew that the first ting would happen, and it's a kind of sound that allows for quiet because it resonates, and then they'd know that there'd be another one coming. And just that encouraging people to have those times of quiet contemplation. And I think particularly if we boundary them, it can help them. So I think using the psalm for some of that's really useful. And that verse 11, I think it's a long time ago now. I think this is the reading that I used at the first synod meeting. When I had to do, I hate keynote speeches. I think it's I don't like that pressure. But anyway, that's what I was asked to do, because we can get so stuck with just looking up to heaven. Well, that's the verse before, isn't it? Where's he gone? What's going on now? And that idea of you don't, he's gone now. Don't keep it's time for you to do something. And as church, we can get stuck going, if only we had Jesus here to tell us what to do or to do it for us. If only we had a minister here to do it for us. If only we had a youth worker to do it for us, or a special category minister to do it for us, we'd be fine. No, the whole thing here of Ascension is that the responsibility is ours.
It's down to you now.
Yeah, and I've always got, I'm not sure if I used then the great example of after having my first baby, when he was about 2 or 3 weeks old, developed thrush. And I went to the doctor who gave me a prescription, and I was holding the prescription and the baby going, how is he going to sign this? Because when you've had a but your brain doesn't really, so I'm looking, and I went, oh, I sign it because I'm the parent and I have to look after this child. But it's kind of, I really think that helps me. Who's going to do this? Is it going to be Jesus? No, it's me. I have to do this now. I have to play my part and be a disciple. And it's no good just staring up, because nothing's going to happen, because actually they've got to leave where they are. They can't even stay in that place. They've got to go back to Jerusalem to see what happens next. And they don't, spoiler alert, they go back and they shut the doors and they still go, we don't really know what's happening. So God gives them another push and another help, but that's for next week. But thanks for that start, Peter. That was really good. Alex, have you got things that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been thinking about Acts and Luke. So there are perhaps some similarities, but also some differences from what Peter said. And I think it's really interesting that drawing on the psalm as well, Peter spoke about contemplation and praise, because for me, one of the joys of these readings in Acts and Luke is that contemplation and praise for me is held together so closely in them, that there's this sense of quiet awe, there's this sense of praise of something that we don't quite understand, this sense of multi-sensory worship that goes completely beyond words to the mystery of God. And that mystery for me was kind of a hinge point in these readings. So if I was to add a kind of dualism to contemplation and praise in talking about these readings, it would be certainty and uncertainty. Because in both Acts and Luke, we have this repeated removal of certainty. And I find the similarities between the two readings really interesting. So in Luke, we have this phrase, he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that the praise bit doesn't happen when Jesus was there. We hear he withdrew from them and was carried up into heaven, and then they praise. So they're actually able to praise in the mystery. They're able to praise in the absence of having a physical person standing up in front of them, in contemporary images, perhaps at a microphone. It's not when the person's standing there that they're filled with joy and praising. It's actually in that absence, in that reflection, in that consideration of all that's been said. And then in Acts, we have the parallel verse, Jesus was lifted up and a cloud took them out of their sight. And I think that's even more interesting, because it's not just that he's lifted up, like in Luke, but that there's a cloud too. So we have this increased sense of uncertainty. and this increased drama of Jesus really is being obscured from the disciples during this reading. So it brings us back to these themes of certainty and uncertainty. This is even more stressed when we read that two strangers or two angels came to the disciples and said, "Stop looking." They're looking up into this uncertainty. There's stop looking. He's going to come back, Just stop looking for that certainty up there. You're not going to find it. When I was reflecting on these, I had a look at a website that I use quite a lot when I'm preparing for worship, called progressivechristianity.org. And they talk about this certainty and uncertainty in terms of idolatry. So they talk about the fact that when we try to limit God to a particular time or place, there's a temptation for idolatry. Perhaps even in the person of Jesus, there's this temptation for the disciples to make Jesus into an idol and to think we need this physical man in this body in order to worship. And they kind of make the parallel that perhaps sometimes we're idolatrous about certain traditions or certain forms of words or certain ways of doing things. I don't know about you two, but I've certainly been in places where we're idolatrous about the tablecloth that we use during communion, for example. So actually to encourage the church to think about what are the things that we fix our eyes on, what are the things that we want to have certainty about, and are we limiting God to particular times and particular spaces and not allowing God to be lifted up into that cloud of unknowing? And in progressive Christianity, they further this by saying that each time an image of God dies, there is the potential for an expanded vision of divinity. Each time an image of God dies, there is the potential for an expanded vision of divinity. And I think that that's really fascinating in the sense that it's once Jesus is lifted up away from them that they praise. So is it that actually in the removal of an earthly figure, they're suddenly able to see more and more and more of God? Is it that Ascension, in being a moment of uncertainty, is also a moment of expansion, a moment in which we can see God even more? And so I think this leads to some really practical questions for the church today. What does Jesus look like when we can't see him in human form anymore? Why do we crave certainty? And then to get down to the really practical, what things are the church uncertain about? I think in any context, churches at the moment are uncertain, right? There's lots of things to be uncertain about. The differences between church and society, if those two things can even be separated. The future of the church, the future of ministry in any particular church. So what are those things that your church is uncertain about? And how can we dwell in that uncertainty a little bit in reflecting on these readings? But not just dwelling in the uncertainty, because that can be kind of depressing, right? A bit nihilistic. Oh, yeah, okay, we're going to die. It's all really difficult. But actually, can we praise in the uncertainty? Can we see the good in the uncertainty? Can we not limit not only God, but ourselves to particular times, particular places, particular people? What are some of the idols that we can see lifted up and replaced with a creativity, a breadth of thinking, perhaps a new way of doing things? Perhaps Ascension is the moment for some blue sky thinking, even if the clouds are slightly obscuring the blue sky. Finally, I've been thinking a little bit about Ascension in relation to the resurrection appearances, and whether Ascension is the moment that the disciples start or stop seeing Christ in others. Because we have all of these resurrection appearances where the disciples see Christ, and often it's not in recognizing Jesus's physical form that they recognize Christ, it's in his actions. And some people reflect that it's almost like they are seeing Christ in others as well as Christ in himself. But at this moment of ascension, that all stops. Jesus is effectively gone. Is this an opportunity to start seeing Christ in even more places? Or is it a moment of fear? And I think that we have that choice too as churches. We have the choice to fear the uncertainty, or we have the choice to start looking around. And so I choose to see it that when Jesus is lifted up, the disciples don't suddenly stop looking around. They don't close their eyes. They don't, as the two people in the Acts reading say, encourage them not to keep looking up at the sky. They're there. They're in the real world. They need to start looking around for Christ in other places and other people. And I think that's our task too. And I would end by just drawing on one other similarity in the two readings, which is stay here and wait. Or as my friends often like to say to me, hurry up and wait, because I'm always rushing around. Hurry up and wait. In both readings, Jesus asks the disciples to stay where they are. And I wonder if we as church are being called to hurry up and wait, to stop trying to struggle our way out of the mystery and the uncertainty, to just sit here and rest with it and see what Jesus is saying to us in the people that we meet each day.
Thanks, Alex. I think it's really interesting to look at the two versions written by the same person and what the differences are. We used to watch Casualty. We stopped a while ago, but and if you watch something for a long time, you know what the characters have. And there was one character who used to have two daughters who suddenly had three sons. And we went, no, she's got a daughter. And so that was part of the end of the road, I think, because we felt that they weren't keeping good records of what the characters were like, and we knew. So that compare and contrast, and why is it that it's slightly different, particularly with the two men, and perhaps it is that one is looking back about the about who Jesus is and what happened, and then in Acts it's much more looking forward to what the church is going to become, and that's why they needed that. And just listening to what you were saying, Alex, I was thinking I might even shoehorn in one of my favourite bits of Matthew's Gospel, which is the very end, and where Jesus doesn't ascend, but he does take them up a hill. Matthew leaves that bit out, but he takes them up the hill as the resurrected Christ, and it says they worshipped even though some of them doubted, and he said, go and make disciples. And I use that a lot because I think it encourages us as people of faith that Jesus isn't just saying you've got to know everything first, that there can be doubt within worship, but we're still called to that shouldn't hold us back, that we're not sure about everything. And I think that idea of living in that time of some doubt and not waiting for the whole mist to clear is really helpful.
I think it's a reminder as well, isn't it, when we were a few weeks ago thinking about Thomas and looking back at Thomas, and had a similar conversation around why is Thomas known as Doubting Thomas instead of Thomas the disciple, because all Thomas was doing was voicing what others felt, but Thomas actually went and believed and went away and proclaimed the gospel. Doubt is so natural, and I was thinking that in what you were saying, Alex, about why do we need such certainty in order to be faithful disciples? And I don't think we do, but I think we almost have a narrative that tells us that's how we ought to be viewing our faith.
Yeah. And I think actually I'd want to try and hang on to the fact that maybe it's almost exactly the other way around. Maybe faith requires doubt. If there's no doubt at all, is it faith or is it just certainty?
And that's when, for some people, the cards just come tumbling down when something just underpins that and the certainty suddenly is taken away in one area, and everything just collapses. Mm.
I just want to throw something in that's totally left field, just because I thought it was really interesting when I read it. So I thought I'd share that with people who can either go, that's very interesting, or that is just totally wild and I never want to think about it again. So I came across somebody called Peter Woods, who's described as a sense maker, relationship and conflict mediator and thinker in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. And he says that he talks about the fact that when the European missionaries came to South Africa, they were faced with a theological conundrum, because a lot of the different indigenous people and the tribes all believed that God, who they gave many different names to, but all of them agreed that God came from the ground. And so the sacred spaces were caves and holes, and the fact that the beloved dead are buried in the kraal is significant because they're going back to God, back to the earth. But then the missionaries came along and went, no, God doesn't live in the earth. God lives in the sky. And that we believe that beyond the earth is hell. So you go, the deeper you go, the more evil you are, if you like. And so it really tore the heart of the theology that was already there in African theologies. And so Peter Wood says, it's really interesting, isn't it, this idea that God, what if we, it is that God lives in the earth, not in the sky. And so if Jesus comes from the God who lives in the earth, he would have descended back into the earth, not so much ascended up. And how would that orientation change our world history? What if the Africans had sent missionaries with this message to Europe and her industrialized siblings instead of the other way round? Would the earth be groaning as she is now? Would we have raped and pillaged the abode of God as we have, all the while believing that God was up there, blessing our taming and subduing of our island home in space? And he says, he's got no theological basis to this. It's just a really interesting idea about Jesus descending as much as ascending. And I guess maybe throwing that in would be about Jesus in the form that he was has left us, but hasn't. Jesus is still with us, and particularly next week's coming, the Holy Spirit kind of emphasizes some of that. But I love that, just trying to turn things upside down and saying, what does that mean? And thinking about how theology could be framed in a different way. But it may just be that's for a Bible study, not a Sunday morning. But I just thought it just made me go, oh, that's really interesting. And so I thought I'd throw it in today. But I think we've got to the point at which we're going to share some other stuff that we could do in worship. So, Peter, what have you got for us today?
Okay, I just got 3 thoughts. First one is, I thought it'd be really good to display some photos around the church of past events. And if you've got some that are church ones that will get people remembering particular times, particular occasions, that would be good. I think we could develop that, and you could actually do the whole service around this by having a few prayer stations around the place as well. When we remember, we tend to become reflective. It's just something that happens as we remember things, we reflect on it, we reflect on the people involved and of their significance to us and the significance of different events to us. And I thought you could do quite an interactive service around that whole idea of then getting people to think about, Jesus' worship can be that way as we remember what's important about our faith. What are the important characteristics of Jesus' life and teaching that enable us to be a people of faith here today? And to just get those conversations, to have time in quiet, in prayer, lots of different ways you could sort of do that. And so that we actually focus on why we are who we are and how we're doing and how we're being those active people that God calls us now to be the disciples of, as Jesus is no longer present in the flesh. And I thought there was maybe a whole service to do around it in that way. So that was one thing. The other I thought about was we all take balloons outside the church, but with messages on those balloons, something that's real to us about faith, discipleship, the love of God. And we watch the balloons disappear, hopefully, that the wind's in the right direction and they go. But that actually the story continues. Just because we can't see them, that balloon will land somewhere, and the message that is with it will be read and understood in a new setting and a new way by somebody else's eyes looking upon it. And I think that's also a challenge to us as church, to make sure we're listening to the voices and seeing through the eyes of those who are not part of our church communities at all. And the other one, which Alex will remember only too well, is at Westcott, they always sent up a rocket on Ascension Day, and we used to go to an Ascension Day service at Westcott, and it finished outside with the rocket going up and making a huge noise and exploding, and then we celebrated. And we used to eat and drink pretty well at Westcott, actually, as well. And so there's something about going from our sight, but hearing the sound, and actually so many people having the consequences of that event. So they're my three things for how we might do things a bit different.
Ooh. So was it a rocket that then had fireworks, or was it just...
Yeah, it was a huge one. They always had a big rocket, didn't they? They still do, I have to say. Yeah, we still get invited to the Ascension Day service on a Thursday.
Fabulous. So Alex, have you got some things to share with us too?
Yeah, it's interesting that Peter's thinking in a very multi-sensory way, because so am I. And there are three kind of things that struck me from a multi-sensory perspective that might be interesting in terms of this. The first one is optical illusions. So thinking about being able to see things multiple ways, because the disciples cannot see clearly. In both of these readings, they're having to kind of look differently or look through a haze. So it may be interesting to play with optical illusions there. But in terms of visuals, the one that I found really particularly interesting was the idea of catching bubbles. So having either bubble blowers, or I don't know if you've seen, you can get these machines that make streams of brilliant bubbles, and asking congregation members to try and catch them. And of course, what happens if you manage to catch a bubble, which is quite difficult in the first place, but what happens if you manage to catch one is it bursts. And actually then, after encouraging people to try and catch the bubbles, then encouraging them to just sit and watch them for a while, and see the beauty of just letting them be and experiencing them without trying to catch or hold on to something. And then I was also thinking about music and silence, because Ascension's always one that I find quite challenging in terms of hymns. There aren't kind of particular hymns that stand out to me as being, oh, that's a great Ascension hymn. But actually, when we're thinking about this mix of contemplation and praise, I was thinking about the fact that it might be really useful for Ascension to actually have some music that doesn't have words, and to encourage people to really listen and to really hear what they feel that God is saying to them through the music, rather than through words. I think in the Reformed tradition, we talk so much about learning through our hymns, and often we mean the words, but actually it's the music that speaks most to some people. When you ask what people's favorite hymns are, it often has as much, if not more, to do with the music than the words. So I wonder what pieces of music would help to catch that vision of Christ being lifted up, and would help us to praise in a contemplative way.
I was thinking of secular music. We could have "I Can See Clearly Now," "Up, Up and Away," no, numerous other ones.
Or do you mean also without words? So like, or in perhaps in languages that we don't understand,
Yeah,
there's vocals, but
yeah.
I'm thinking Sigur Rós, it's kind of very spooky, ethereal music. Is it Icelandic? I think that having in another language just kind of increases that sense of being swept away in it without focusing on what the words are. I don't think you could set a hymn to Sigur Rós anyway. So I've got a few things, and let's see if I can share screen. I used to be good at this, but I'm not really anymore. So, right, so here's some things, firstly, that are online. So this is Jan Richardson. So Jan Richardson writes a lot of poems and creates art for each week of the lectionary. Do not just copy the images, because she's an artist, and so you can buy the image, but you can't just use them. So there are details on the website about that. So that they're always really interesting abstract pieces of art, but it's more this reflection, which is stay, a blessing for Ascension Day. And it's also about grieving, really. And she's someone who lost her husband very suddenly 10 years ago. And I love that waiting. And it says, particularly, wait and see what comes to fill the gaping holes in your chest. Wait with your hands open to receive what could never come, except to what is empty and hollow. Wait, still yourself and stay. And I like that. It's that being comfortable in the not knowing and the waiting. And I think she expresses that really beautifully. So it's called The Painted Prayer Book. Now I've got to see if I can get to the other things. Thank you. So then there's this painting. I always love looking at art. So this is Salvador Dali's The Ascension of Christ. And it's an interesting perspective. And there's just, a lot to reflect on with the dove. And I'm really not sure what that is behind him that he's going up to. Is it seeds in a flower, or I don't know a lot about art really, but I think it's, you could look at different ones, and I'll try in a minute to show something that's been painted in a wall in Bristol, but I've got to go out of doing this to something else. And then something else here is, we haven't talked about Malcolm Guite for a while. Fans of Talking Absolute Worship, we might have already had the sonnet for Ascension, but it is so beautiful. Where he talks about Jesus. He took us with him to the heart of things. The heart that broke for all the broken-hearted is whole and heaven-centered now, and sings in the strength that rises out of weakness. Just absolutely beautiful. So you can have Malcolm read it. So if you press play there, we'd get to hear his lovely voice. If you've got somebody in the congregation who's good at reading poetry, having the words up but having it read, I think, can be really helpful, and just letting there be a silence or perhaps some music to reflect on the words, because there is just so much in those 14 or 16 lines, can't remember how long a sonnet is, but just every word is so perfect and helps us think about the deepness of this. Now I think I'm going to stop share in order to share a different screen because I can't do it any other way. So here we go. So here is let's see if I can get him big. I love this. So this is on a wall in Bristol. I don't know if it's still there. I went on an art tour at Bristol, didn't see this one, but I think that's just fab. That's just Jesus floating away. But again, there's something of joy there, I think, because of the yellow behind, and just that little bit of the hills at the bottom. It's very simple, and Jesus looks to be at peace with that. It's kind of, my work is done, and quite often I think I could probably very happily just almost every week have lots of different artworks from one of the readings and say, just have a look at these and see which speaks to you, and try and work, sit with the Bible passage. Why is it that this artwork particularly helps you to think about this?
I still think my pen that I got from Mount St. Michel when was going up amongst all the little stalls that sell everything on the way, and I just had to buy it. It was just an old-fashioned biro pen, and when you press on, Jesus ascends. And when you turn off, Jesus comes back to earth.
Yeah.
I mean, tacky or what? But it just gave me hours of fun.
That sounds absolutely perfect. Maybe somebody clever could do some of that for this Sunday. Or you could go all waltzing and fix some feet to the ceiling.
Yeah.
But I think fixing the feet to the ceiling is that sense of holding on to Jesus. Because you can't quite let him go, and actually where the balloons work well is we're just letting go, or the bubbles that we can't hold on, and that we need to play our part as well. So there's a whole host of different things there. Pick one idea. We always say, just as a reminder to someone, don't try and do all of these. Ascension comes around every year. You might find that you've got your next 3 ascensions planned, so you can focus on the psalm one time, looking at Luke and Acts another, or doing things in different ways, and it really depends on your context as to what's going to suit best. But I hope that we have got your brains working, got you thinking, got you ready to go. Well, I'm going to have to look somewhere else as well, but here's some ideas that we hope will help you in your worship preparation. And to continue to help us in all of that, Alex is going to pray for us and for you as you prepare worship today.
Let's pray. God, as we hold this tension between contemplation and worship, between action and waiting, between certainty and uncertainty, be with us as we prepare and create in all of our knowing and unknowing, in all of our play, in all of our reaching, and in all that we create together. Amen.
Amen.